Okay, so a quick sit rep on Lance Stroll's situation, and it's not looking good. Since the news that Adrian Newey will be taking over as Aston Martin team principal in 2026, the general view is that Lance will be one of the first names on the chopping block. The feeling is that his days at Aston Martin are numbered, and that Newey will twist Lawrence's arm into replacing him with a big name, high caliber, hotshot driver, posing an immediate threat to not just his place at Aston Martin, but on the F1 grid entirely, because I'm not really sure who else would take him. But what if there was something that Lance could do? Something that's very high in demand, something that every top title contending team wants, but no driver is currently prepared to do. So right now, with Adrian Newey on board, coupled with the new Honda engine, Aston Martin look like they're going to be going places fast. Wins, world championships, who knows? And so if Aston Martin are going to be pushing for these world championships in 2027, 28, who knows, maybe even 2026, what's one thing that they could need that would give them the best possible chance? Well, something that would help massively is a number one driver and a number two driver. And this is exactly where I think the opportunity for Lance Stroll lies. He could not only save his career, but he could also extend it by becoming a proper, real deal, what do you need, boss, number two driver. And something like this could also try and help salvage his reputation, which quite frankly right now is in the toilet. So right now, Fernando Alonso is leading the Aston Martin team, but in the next few years, who knows, there could be some big names joining the team, such as Charles Leclerc, Oscar Piastri. Both seem to be pretty unhappy-ish at their current teams. And if one of these big names were to join, all would want a title push, all would want an obedient number two driver who was going to take one for the team. Now I know what you're thinking, Aston Martin could easily get a much better driver to fill this position, and you're absolutely right, of course they could. But I sense after a little while, this much better driver than Stroll, this whole arrangement of being number two driver would get to him. The frustration would build and all the toys would explode out of the pram, and then sooner or later, Aston will be back to square one. Right now, the robust number two driver is an entity that isn't available anywhere else in Formula One because every driver is so focused on their legacy, pride, and also winning, even though realistically they haven't a hope in hell. And this is exactly where Lance comes in, because by facing reality and doing a job that no other driver out there wants to do, he could massively extend his career, and also for years beyond its current expected span. It's also a simple case of supply and demand. I think a lot of teams are going to be looking at how McLaren have made an absolute meal of this season, are going to look at that and figure out how we could potentially do things better if we were in that position. They tried to do things equally, made it a lot harder than it needed to be, and I think this just stresses that point even further. Had they implemented a clear 1 and 2 strategy, the championship would be over, the trophy would have been in Woking weeks ago, and the whole thing would have been done and dusted. But that's not the case, because Red Bull focused on a single driver in Max Verstappen and managed to close a gap of over 100 points to close to single figures, while McLaren are dithering over Lando and Oscar and who gets the window seat. And especially if a driver like Oscar Piastri is going to make his way to Aston Martin in the coming years, especially after the sharing is caring disaster at McLaren, he will want absolutely priority treatment with all the effort and all the strategy pointing his direction. And this then clicks perfectly with this opportunity that I see for Lance. Now, I genuinely think this could work, but I'm sure you're probably sitting there thinking, why choose Lance Stroll? Well, firstly, he's already at the team. Secondly, I don't think there's any driver out there currently that would be willing to do this. And thirdly, despite the absolutely catastrophic driving that we've seen from Lance at times, when he's properly motivated and properly interested, he can be all right. When he's properly into it, he can be acceptable almost. An upper midfield driver at best, but as a number two driver at Aston Martin that's going to be supporting the championship hopes of the number one driver, that's all he really needs to be. Any more than that, and you start to run into tensions and egos and things like this. Now, with Adrian Newey running the show and coming from Red Bull, which famously favoured the driver 1 and 2 dynamic over the years, this very well could be a possibility that he's going to want to go for. It worked for Max Verstappen, it worked with Sebastian Vettel, and I'm sure, done correctly, it can work again. And with Fernando Alonso or someone else spearheading their campaign, they will need the other to support and do a job from time to time when needed, and do their best to increase the chances of success for their teammate, and most importantly, have no qualms, issues, or problems about doing this. And also fight any natural urges or notions for wins or glory or things like this. Now, if Lance is going to accept a number 2 role in an Aston Martin team that's fighting for the championship, he is going to switch up completely about how he thinks of himself as a driver and also his position within Formula One. He has to no longer see himself as an athlete, untapped talent, champion in waiting. All of that has to go. He must absolutely look at this as almost like a business deal. It's absolutely an arrangement where you can prolong your career, rebuild your brand, and make yourself useful and indispensable. Potentially as well, it's also a way of him paying back Lance Stroll, his dad, after him investing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into his career over the years. And I do have a feeling if Adrian Newey, with all the weight behind him, said to Lawrence, look, the only way that Lance is going to stay at this team and the sport is if he becomes this number 2 driver and basically the whipping boy for the lead driver, I'm sure Lawrence, with his business head on him, is going to make this work. Because to Lawrence, this sort of arrangement is a business deal. It's basically speaking his language. So it would also be a win-win on the leadership front because, of course, Lawrence gets to keep his son in Formula One, and Adrian, if he chooses to go for it, gets to have that 1 and 2 dynamic that has worked for teams that he's been at so far. Because if Lance is going to make this work and adjust to life as this new number 2 driver, he is going to have to take a leaf out of the greatest number 2 driver of all time, Eddie Irvine's book. Earn as much money as you can, get as much fame as you can, drive a car that you would otherwise have no business driving, and whilst all this is going on, make it work for you. Make yourself a complete inconvenience for other teams and do all you can to make sure that your teammate wins. In fact, Eddie Irvine was so switched on with this perspective of being number 2 driver at Ferrari, there were all sorts of benefits in his contract for doing jobs for Michael Schumacher. For example, if Irvine had to give up a first position place for Michael, Eddie Irvine had it negotiated in his contract that he would be paid the bonus for first place. And so in his mind, he still got paid at the end of the day. What did he care? He saw it as less of a sporting move and much more of a business one. And now with Lawrence Stroll's business head on him, I'm sure that he could have a conversation with Lance and make this work. Now, other than extending his career and all that, this might also be a chance for him to rescue or even salvage some of his reputation in the sport, which, as I mentioned earlier, is in the toilets. I don't think I need to pull up stats to say that he is currently right now the most uncharming and very difficult to like driver out there on the grid right now. And that's not because of his driving or the nepotistic reason he's in Formula One on the whole. It's more that his attitude stinks. He's like one of those rich kids you'd see on MTV where they get annoyed because their dad bought him a Lexus instead of a Ferrari. Utterly toxic and with very, very few redeeming qualities. But what if one day Lance was to do a job out there on the track that would help the likes of Fernando Alonso, Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc win a drivers' championship for Aston Martin? What would you think of him then? That is possibly the only thing I can think of that would help move the needle on the dial of Lance Stroll's reputation. I mean, who knows? Rather than being known as the guy who absolutely doesn't deserve to be in Formula One, he could be known as the guy who potentially helped Fernando Alonso to his 3rd world championship. Just think of that. A tiny, small part of this hypothetical Lance Stroll rebrand. Now, there's also the big question of would Lance do it? And I think that depends entirely on his values. Would he prefer to be part of a small club of drivers who have driven an Adrian Newey Formula One car and also salvage part of his reputation, or sit on the sofa and play tennis and nobody in F1 take him seriously for the rest of his life? And also, by assuming this new position in the team, if Aston Martin are going to be fighting at the front, there's a possibility he could pick up podiums, perhaps even wins, if his teammate is out of contention. So to me, this sounds like a pretty sweet deal. Now, the thing is, we could talk about this all day long, Lance Stroll being a number 2 driver and everything, but you do have to wonder, is there even an appetite from the fans or F1 on the whole to see something like this? It's all very good and well suggesting he could be a good number 2 driver on paper, but you do have to wonder as well, has this ship already sailed? Has F1 simply had enough of Lance Stroll, and is he really ultimately the guy who is holding Aston Martin back from being a team that's taken seriously? So ultimately, I think a big part of stepping into this number 2 role and making it a success is if the fans, backers and sponsors will accept this, and most importantly, want to see it as well. Because ultimately, the 1 and 2 driver system can be seen as outdated and also implies that one driver isn't being as good as he can be, or even being given the same opportunities. And therefore, it might not be something that a modern team and also its sponsors and backers and everyone who's associated with it would want to get behind in a day of equal opportunities for everybody. But on the other hand, if a team like Aston Martin with Adrian Newey at the helm want to give themselves every advantage, every possible opportunity to win the Drivers' World Championship, let alone the Constructors' Championship, then from what we've seen with McLaren this season and how they've made an absolute meal of it, a clear 1 and 2 driver strategy could be the way forward. But then bringing in this back to Lance himself, right now there currently aren't that many things that could ultimately save his career. However, something like this would just give that small glimmer of hope, that tiny light at the end of the tunnel where he could maybe turn it around. But of course, he would have to do the rest and stay motivated, which he kind of struggles to do, as well as put in the performances, which he also struggles to do. But if he succeeded, rather than being remembered as the guy who was in Formula One just because of his dad and his money, he could be remembered as that guy who helped Fernando Alonso or even Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, or someone else win their first Drivers' World Championship and also be remembered at Aston Martin for completely different reasons. It may not be much, but I think it's far, far better than the trajectory that he's currently on. Now, I know Lance is a very difficult subject to talk about, but guys, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Would this work? Would it not? Will Aston Martin even get to a position where they can consider a 1 and 2 setup and head for the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship? Let me know your thoughts. Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you enjoyed it even more, and I'm Paul, and I'll see you later. Cheers.